Hi guys, and welcome to my channel. My name is Mary Laura. I make functional ceramics for interior design. In this channel I talk about my life as an artist, about the business career of an artist, about clay, glazes, paper, and everything in between. This video I intended for the beginner ceramics or for ceramics who are in the middle of moving somewhere. Imagine you made a piece, you trimmed it, you smoothed it out, but now it's just staying there waiting for it to be bisque fired and glaze fired. Where do you fire it? In this video I talk about several ways of how you can find a kiln to fire your ceramics. Kiln choice is not only about the convenience, it's also about the temperature, your preferred firing range, whether you can experiment or not. All of this, of course, is a luxury because very often we just have one kiln available, and of course the best option is having your own kiln. But when that's not an option, what else can you do? Let's figure it out. Option number one is to join a community studio, if you have one in your city or town. There's different options of how a community studio could look like. In LA, in Los Angeles, where I live, we have all the different range of community studios because we have a lot of people want to make ceramics, and so there are a lot of community studios. There are gigantic community studios that have more than 250 members, and there are also tiny ones that have 5 to 6 members that are more like shared community space. All of those are options, and all of those require a specific fee to be paid. The fee, again, ranges based on whatever you are, what country you're in, what kind of economy you're in, and whether it's a rural place or a big expensive city. LA is quite pricey, so our community membership costs anywhere from $100 to $350, and that's for a gigantic studio with 100+ members. If you're renting a space with a few other potters, it could be a little bit more expensive because renting a studio costs around $2,000 or $3,000. You could probably share the price with between maybe 5 to 10 members. The price is going to depend on how many people there are in the community studio, but there's always a price. And for me, it is a disadvantage because when I tried joining a community studio, when I wanted to fire my pieces, I went there only twice because I did not need to have a space. I just needed to fire it somewhere. I already had a space set up in my home, so I didn't really want to rely on it. So the first time I went there was to sign up, and the second time I went there was to sign out and drop the community studio. So I didn't end up using it as much, but I have a lot of friends who go to community studio and who really benefit from it. In addition to being able to fire your pieces, the conditions of firing your pieces will depend on the community studio. The community studios I went to either charge by cubic inches, so you have to measure your piece, the height, the diameter, the width, the length, multiply it all and write it down, or by weight or by piece, just depends on a specific community studio. Of course, there's a lot of restrictions. You sometimes have to use very specific clay or only the clay that the community studio is selling. I don't think that a lot of experimentations are allowed. I think you're supposed to write down the glaze that you're using so that people will know for sure where to put your piece and how they can fire it. For example, if you're firing lava glazes or puffy glazes, and if you haven't watched the video about the puffy glaze review, you can watch it above, then those glazes expand and you do have to warn your kiln techs that those glazes are going to go crazy. You also probably can't fire weird stuff like rocks and combustible in the community kilns unless you agreed upon it and unless they let you do that. Big advantages of going to a community space like that is that normally they have very big kilns. At least some of the places where I went, they have gigantic gas reduction kilns, and that's also a luxury nowadays because having my own reduction kiln in an apartment is clearly not possible. So if I can go and fire a gigantic thing in a gigantic kiln, that's also a good thing. It's obviously going to cost quite a bit, but at least there is an opportunity to make big pieces and fire them. The disadvantages, as I mentioned before, include a lot of control. So everyone is going to control you, what glazes you're using, and you don't have any control of how they're fired, where they're going to be put in the kiln. Sometimes kiln techs break things. That happens rarely, but sometimes that happens. You wouldn't be able to affect neither the kiln shelf, and there could be different temperature, know how and when your pieces are going to be fired, and the turnover time sometimes quite long, from 2 weeks to months to 2 months if we're talking about plates or larger pieces. So you have to count for that, but if it is an option and if the price doesn't scare you, I think it's a great option instead of getting your own kiln and risking because sometimes we just don't have the opportunity to get the kiln, or we don't have a place to put it on. So community studio is definitely option number one of how to fire your pieces. Option number two is basically exactly the same option, but instead of joining the membership, you might be able to just bring your pieces to community studio and fire it there. I struggled to find a studio like that, even in Los Angeles, and we have maybe 20 or 30 studios around the greater LA. Most of the studios just don't want to risk it. They don't really care about those extra few dollars for firing, but they're risking the whole kiln and a whole load of people's work. What could happen is if you fire low fire clay that's not intended for high temperature, it could ruin the whole kiln, it could ruin the shelves and everyone's work. So community studios don't want to risk it. They don't want things to melt and destroy others' pieces, and so they very often opt out from firing pieces from outside the membership. However, I did find a few studios that fire people's pieces even if they're not members, and they do charge by the inch or they charge by the shelf, just depending on the community studio. So I found a couple. Most of them fire cone 5, sometimes cone 6, and the explanation behind it is that it's much easier to underfire and it's much less risky to underfire than to overfire. If the studio again fires to cone 10, but the person brings clay that's only cone 5 or 6, then those pieces might melt and destroy the whole kiln, which we don't want to do. Honestly, it's very rare that clay that's intended to cone 5 or 6 actually melts fully at cone 10, but there is a possibility like that. If you haven't tested, you don't know what's going to happen. And sometimes people bring earthenware or clay that's intended for very, very low temperatures and fire it to cone 10. If that happens, then that's done. There's going to be a huge puddle of lava-like textured clay, melted clay at the bottom of the kiln, and that's going to ruin the kiln, and that's a lot of money to replace it. So basically, it's hard to find. That's the main con of a commercial firing service like this that a community studio might offer, but if you can find it, that's probably the best option out there. It also costs money, and if you look at Kilnshare and check the prices are normally quite high, or they might seem to be quite high. They might be somewhere between $90 to $200 per full kiln, and maybe $50 to $90 per shelf. But if you actually think about it, how much it actually costs to fire a kiln, then those prices actually make sense. Because to fire a full kiln, for me personally, costs around $30 one firing, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on when I'm firing, depending on the season, depending on the duration of the firing. But let's say it's about $30, plus it's time for the person to meet you, to take your pieces, to load it to the kiln, and then to unload it, to give it back to you. So all of this involves some time. When I helped some of the friends to fire their pieces, it just took me a long time, and I don't have this extra time. And if I'm gonna spend this extra time loading and unloading somebody else's pieces, well, I have to be super careful. I have to make sure that they don't stand next to some dangerous pieces. Then I would want to charge a specific price for that. So I don't think people really make a lot of money, but it does pay for some of the risks. It does pay for this time that they spend loading and unloading, and it pays for electricity. The thing it doesn't pay for is your liability and your responsibility for a ruined kiln. In case something goes wrong, like let's say something explodes or collapses or glaze runs into the kiln shelf while you didn't bring your cookie or didn't warn the person that you have something untested or some kind of glaze that you didn't test before. So all of this you're going to be responsible for. And of course, sometimes glaze firings go wrong. Maybe the kiln is under firing or over firing because you don't have any control over the programming, over how the kiln is firing. You're not going to be able to control the results either. I would say basically no matter where you fire, if it's not your kiln, you're probably not going to be in control of the results anyway. Sometimes some people will allow you to control the firing. They will let you program the kiln properly. They will let you assemble things in an interesting way. I think it just really depends on what the person is like and who is renting the kiln. So I would say that's a good option if it is available in your area. Again, if it's a very rural area and there's nothing around, then it's going to be much harder to find. But there might be at least one potter in your area whom you could talk to. And this is actually the next option that I wanted to mention, is finding a local artist, especially if you are in a small area and if there's no commercial studios or anything like that. You can just Google pottery, or you can Google potters of the specific area, and you can text them on Instagram or email and talk about potentially renting a kiln, especially especially if you offer a good price, they would be able to help you. You might also potentially make friends with them, and I think that's a good opportunity. Of course, option number 5 is to find a good friend, to find a pottery friend. You can find those people on Instagram, on the internet, or local events, art fairs, anything like that. If you're sociable, if you can network properly, then once you start doing pottery, you're actually gonna know a lot of people immediately, or almost immediately. Like after 3 or 4, 6 months of doing pottery, you'll probably know quite a few ceramics people. And if you're good friends with them, they can probably fire a couple of pieces for you, no problem, especially if those pieces are not something really crazy that can potentially ruin the kiln. But you might be able to even agree on the payment just per electricity, so that's going to be the cheapest option, especially if it's a nice friend and they let you do it. It's also your friend, so I think it's much easier to talk to them about and discuss what you're firing, and just like a friendly, I think friends can help fire things in a friendly way. There's no commercial interest in this relationship, so you will be able to fire it quite cheaply. However, it's probably quite limited capacity and you don't want to overuse the help of your friend, so I think while it's a really great option for a hobbyist, it's probably not a very good option if you begin to sell your work and overuse your friend's kiln, which might potentially ruin your relationships or ruin your kiln. And if you ruin their kiln, that might ruin your relationships and cost you a lot of money. So anyway, whenever you're using somebody else's kiln or your kiln, just be extra careful with what you're firing. Check in with the person who owns the kiln and ask them if they're okay with whatever you're firing. Tell them which clay you're using, which glazes you're using, and how you'd like to be fired, so that it's safe for you and it's safe for others. Option number 6, and one of my favorite options, is to join a community college or university classes. Very often, if you're a resident in the States, you can join a community college for very, very cheaply. And a lot of community colleges have art programs. Not all of them have ceramics, but for example, in Los Angeles, I know at least 4 or 5 colleges that have really good ceramic program. The classes are cheap. You get clay, you get to use their glazes, you get to fire things, you get to know the teachers, you get to know other students and artists. It's just always a really good vibe, especially in the arts department. I feel like people are a lot more fun and a lot more creative and talkative. So those ceramic classes begin to grow into something bigger than just ceramics, bigger than just a community college class, and just become a really nice, solid community of friends that will grow along with you. There's obviously disadvantages. If there's no class, then there's no firings. Community colleges sometimes might take your pieces to fire if you are not taking the class, but I feel like it's very rare unless you know someone, one of the teachers or a kiln tech. I don't think that happens very often because they have quite strict guidelines of what they can do and what they can't do. So I think ideally you would join a class. What happened with me, and I think it is more of an exception than a rule, at some point I took higher level classes, and at those level classes I could actually explore and experiment a lot more, both with the glazes and with my shapes, and I can kind of do self-study, independent study, rather than follow a very strict curriculum. Otherwise, colleges do have a very strict curriculum, so you will have to adhere to that and you'll have to do whatever the college asks you to. And sometimes those assignments are fun and sometimes they're super silly and you don't want to be making gigantic shoe sculpture, or at least I don't want to be making a gigantic shoe sculpture. So I want to stick to my vases, for example. So sometimes it could be not as fun, and most of the time it is very fun and very good environment for learning, for growing, and also for firing your pieces. As a side note, I think community colleges is a cheat code for our society, because being a student in America gives you so many perks. It's crazy. Even if you take one class, it opens up so many different doors. I mean, from libraries to free groceries in case you're in need, to grants, different studying opportunities, to discounts on various things like Amazon and Icon Pass and all of the other things. I think it's something that we pay our taxes for and something that we can use, especially if we are actually students. The last option, I needed to include it because that's the most obvious solution, but it's the hardest one, is to get your own kiln. Yes, it's intimidating, yes, it's hard, but in case you have this opportunity, even if you have a nice ventilated area for your kiln, you can do it. There are tiny kilns that work at 110 watts. You don't have to rewire your electricity. This is where I started. I just started with a tiny kiln. It was probably that big, so it only fit maybe 3 or 4 cups, but that's all I needed at the time. I didn't make big pieces. I just wanted to experiment, to begin firing my own kiln. I also found used kilns most of my life, so this tiny kiln that I found was only $100. It didn't require any electricity, it just needed good ventilation, and I had a nice patio where I could put it. And then if you do decide to get a big kiln, at least in the United States, you do have to rewire your electricity. You need a separate breaker, you need a specific set of cords, a specific plug. You need to make sure that your electric panel can support the amperage of your kiln. Basically, ideally, you would need to find an electrician, a certified electrician, who can do all of this for you. So it's quite a bit of an investment, but if you're going to fire more than 20 times, I think it's worth it, because if you think about it, one rent of a whole kiln costs $100. If you can find a used kiln for $2,000 and then throw in another $500 to $1,000 on rewiring, then let's say it's $3,000. That means 30 firings on, you're going to be making profit. But for me, for example, I had a certified electrician friend and they did it for me, and I just got a kiln for $300. So of course it made a lot more sense to get my own kiln because I had this opportunity. So it paid off a long time ago. If I went to a community studio all this time, this 3 years, that would have added up to about $5,000, and I only paid $300 for my kiln. So of course it made sense. Obviously, I pay a lot more for the electricity. For example, this month I fired so much. I just had to fire. I wanted to fire everything. I wanted to finish everything. And I finally figured out how to preheat my bisque. So I fired maybe 15 or 16 times. And for me, it's a lot. I'm going to be waiting for my electricity bill. I think it's going to be gigantic. There's also a lot of other hassle that is included into the kiln setting, like permissions, insurances, and all that. That's also adding up. But if you can, your own kiln is always a really good option. Of course, if it's not available for now, or if you're not sure if you're going to be doing pottery so much, then all the other 6 options are always available. You just have to look hard. Again, if you're in a big city, there's probably a community studio, there's probably kiln share, there's probably a lot of potters, and maybe even a community college with classes. But if you're in a small community, then you can just Google local potters, or you can ask around and ask if there is anyone who fires pottery, and just make friends with them and talk to them, and you'll be able to fire a couple of cups that you made. I hope this is helpful. I hope this gives you a few ideas. I know that having a kiln is a privilege, and not owning a kiln is really sad for potters and for ceramic artists. So I hope everyone can find where to fire their pieces, and let this not stop you from creating. Thank you so much for watching. Feel free to subscribe, like this video, follow me, and I'll see you in the next video.